Hello and welcome to Business on the Wire. In October last year, an 18-year-old Chechen refugee in France beheaded schoolteacher Samuel Paty days after he'd shown caricatures of Prophet Mohammed to his students. President Macron went on to announce a controversial anti-separatism bill and other measures that included school education reforms to ensure that children from the Muslim community do not drop out, stricter controls on mosques and preachers, all of which raised concerns amongst the Muslim community in France. But France is not the only country in the West, and not just in the West, negotiating its way through the intricacies of race and religion. What are the current challenges faced by communities in Europe and North America of Muslim descent in light of the development of these counter radicalization policies? And what are the social and economic lessons to draw for other countries as well? Joining me to talk about all of that is Professor Juliette Calony. She is Assistant Professor in Sociology at Sciences Po. Well, thank you so much, Professor, for joining in and speaking with me. I want to, through your eyes, take a few steps back to that incident in October. Would you say it marked for France at least sort of a tectonic shift in terms of how people came to view any policy around religion or around Islam as a religion itself? Or do you think this was something that was, building and this was almost like the climactic moment?
Yeah, so France, has been hit by terrorist attacks committed in the name of Islam for quite some time now. The most terrible attacks of 2015 were a big trauma for the French population, both with the attack on Charlie Hebdo and a Jewish convenience store in January 2015, and then the attacks of Paris in November that claimed a very large number of lives. So I think 2015 was a major moment, traumatic moment for France. And in 2020, we had the fifth anniversary of these attacks, and we also had the trial of the people who committed the attacks against Charlie Hebdo. So 2020, September was this big moment where, France was reviving the memories of these traumatic attacks. And it was also the moment in the beginning of October when the French government decided to implement new steps in order to address the issue of what Emmanuel Macron called Islamist separatism. So he made a speech, our president, Emmanuel Macron, made a speech on October 2nd, in which he announced the need to fight against what he calls separatisms. So this idea that we are witnessing a multiplication of separate Islamist enclaves in France that provide a ground for terrorism. So he announced already on October 2nd a series of measures in order to strengthen the control of the state over Islam as a religion. Those measures including a tighter control over associations, specifically the finances of association, the end of homeschooling for children, a tighter control over private religious schools, and increased surveillance of places of worship, an obligation for the employees of private companies that provide public services to also be religiously neutral in their appearance and their behavior. It's already the case for civil servants, but now that obligation of being religiously neutral, specifically in your appearance, is being extended to employees of private companies that work for the state. And also he announced the construction of what he calls an enlightened French Islam. So this idea that the state could contribute to building and reforming Islam as a religion. So there was already this dynamics in place. And then on October 16th, the atrocious murder of a teacher, Samuel Paty, took place. So this was another terrific moment for France. So he was beheaded by a young 18-year-old man who wanted to punish him for showing caricatures of the Prophet Mohammed in class. So that moment was again terrible, and it led to an acceleration of the measures that Emmanuel Macron had already announced. But these measures were already in the pipes. So that event only accelerated something that was already there for quite some time.
As you said, many of these decisions did not go down well, whether it was banning the burqa headscarves in about 5 countries in the European region, or changing the family laws around, I imagine, to sort of bring down stricter control on immigration. What's your sense of what the impact on the social fabric is, Professor? Because these decisions have global ramifications. World over, I think governments are now thinking harder and harder about attacking this from the policy side by way of laws or by way of new charters, as you said. But what is the impact, is your sense, on the social fabric when you try to attack it in this way?
Yes, so you're right. So France is trying to enforce a very strict version of secularism that is very assertive, in the sense that the state really tries to remove religious expression, and specifically Islamic religious expression, from the public sphere. So from 2004, the French state decided to ban religious symbols in public schools. So you can still wear them in private schools and in the street, but in public schools it's forbidden. And in 2010, they decided to ban the full Islamic veil, the niqab, from public space as well. And now we have these new laws that are currently being debated in Parliament. About trying to enforce control over Islamic associations. This is, the path that France has chosen to follow, but it has an impact in terms of citizenship for the Muslim minority in this country. It has been demonstrated that a lot of Muslim girls wearing the veil had to leave school after the ban on religious symbols. It has also been demonstrated that the new attack on freedom of association will have an impact in terms of how Muslim citizens of this country feel they belong to the nation. In the aftermath of the murder of Samuel Paty, the French state decided to dissolve a number of Muslim associations, including one humanitarian association called Radicalization, and another association which is very central, which was the Collective Against Islamophobia, that was playing a very important role in supporting victims of Islamophobia in France. Now, this association has been dissolved, and it sends a very worrying signal to many Muslim citizens who really rely on these associations to defend their rights. And it has also been shown that it is through their involvement in associations, organizations, even if they're religious or Islamic, that young Muslims build their citizenship and their feeling of belonging to the nation. So when you attack that with a series of laws that really jeopardize the feelings of belonging to that nation, and this can lead to a willingness to withdraw from public life, which can be very dangerous.
I know I'm asking you to veer into territory which you may not have examined very closely, but what is your sense of what the economic implications of these sort of decisions might be, Professor? Because we did see a whole barrage of external reactions to the decisions that France took. There was a boycott for a while for among some of these Muslim nations in terms of French retailers and French products, and there has been pushback against a nation like Saudi Arabia as well, where the allegation is that they're the ones that are pumping in a lot of money, particularly in terms of construction of mosques. Are there very clear economic ramifications of trying to draw, very strong pro or anti-radicalization policies?
I don't know about the economic implications in terms of foreign funding and how France is perceived. I think the boycott lasted for a while, but Emmanuel Macron has put up this whole communication strategy in order to, get a better control over the situation. I am more worried in terms of economic inequalities in France. So there are many studies that demonstrate that French Muslim citizens face considerable discrimination in access to employment, access to housing, and education. And so those socioeconomic inequalities are also something that creates a lot of tension and that can fuel feelings of exclusion and lead to radicalization for the most deprived and vulnerable sections of the population. And by enforcing new laws that target explicitly some fragments of the population based on religion, you only increase feelings of deprivation and exclusion. So I'm more worried in terms of the socioeconomic consequences internally. As far as the construction of mosques is concerned, Emmanuel Macron said that there would be a tighter control over foreign funding for mosques. So we already know that a number of states, such as Morocco, Algeria, Turkey, Saudi Arabia provides some funding for the construction of mosques in France, but this is very transparent. And in fact, most of the funding for the construction of mosques in France comes from the faithful, comes from the believers themselves that provide small donations. The most important thing is that Emmanuel Macron really wants to control foreign funding that comes from private donors, on which there is very little monitoring. But as far as the states are concerned, there are very open relations with the ambassador from Saudi Arabia, who is very transparent about the amount of money he gives to construct mosques. So that is not a main problem. What Emmanuel Macron said in terms of foreign interference is that it is now forbidden for foreign imams to be imams in French mosques. So there is now new measures in order to ensure that the imams who are in the French mosque are from France and that they do not come from abroad.
You raise an important point about this thread of socioeconomic inequity, though, Professor. And, the thing is that this is not a problem that's unique to France. This othering of Muslims as a community has happened across Europe. There are echoes of it across the Asian region and in the US as well. Is that a common thread that you see, this deep socioeconomic inequity running across different continents?
Yes, absolutely, and I think it is also part of the stigmatization of Islam, which is strongly associated in the public imagination with the lower sections of society. But there are differences across countries. So it is true that in Europe, most Muslim populations come from lower middle classes. This is due to the history of Europe, colonization and then immigration after the 50s and the 60s. But if you look at a country like the United States, for instance, the situation of the Muslim minority there is quite different because a significant portion of immigrant Muslims that have come from the Middle East, but also South Asia, India, and Pakistan are people who are quite well off and who belong to the upper and middle classes. So for a very long time, these people who are, work as engineers, lawyers, professors wanted really to become part of the American mainstream, and they had the socioeconomic resources to do so. But their aspirations have been, thwarted after 9/11 and the war on terror. So the situation is very different, I would say, between Europe, where the Muslim population is suffering socioeconomically, and the United States, where at least the immigrant part of the Muslim population was more successful for a long period of time.
What do you think might be the lessons to draw for nations like India, Professor? As you may have read, we are promulgating laws as well. These relate, of course, more in the domain of marriage, but there are 2 points of criticism. One, that this is attacking only a specific community, and two, that this is actually quite patriarchal in nature, where women are not seen as being independent or thoughtful enough to make decisions about their marriage. But again, the thread is the same, where you're trying to attack one particular community via policy making, via law making. 2 states have done it already, and other states are considering it. Sitting on the outside, what are your thoughts when you see this?
So I do not have any lessons to give to India on any matter, but I think it's very interesting to compare, you're right, the policy that are being implemented in France and in India, for instance. So you have 2 secular countries, but that practice different versions of secularism. And I would say that in France, secularism is currently being used as a tool to target the Muslim community by excluding religion from the public sphere. While I would say in India, secularism is something that has long been understood as something that will protect the Muslim minority from the ideology of Hindutva that would want to define India as a purely Hindu nation. So there is a difference here, but there are also similarities in the sense that both the French and the Indian state try to intervene in religious matters. And this is never, I would say, a good thing. The idea behind secularism is the strict separation of church and state. And although in France this is a central principle, you see that it has never really applied to Islam. Already during the colonial period, France did not respect the principle of secularism because it really interfered in the matters of Islam by deciding what Islam should be and what it should look like. And you see it again today when the President Emmanuel Macron says he wants to promote an enlightened Islam, so an Islam in conformity with the French state. It is not clear at all how he's going to do it and what type of legitimacy he will receive. It's never a good thing when the state tries to interfere with religious matters. And I think you see it very clearly in India today with a set of anti-conversion laws where the state is trying to decide what is a sincere religious conversion, so what is a sincere marriage as opposed to love, jihad, or forced conversion. But whenever the state tries to interfere in intimate matter, such as love and faith and conscience, it never creates good things.
Some have gone so far as to say that perhaps we're looking at this problem through a completely wrong lens, Professor, where we are attacking Islam as being the source of the problem, not realizing that it's a world where we have never had this much inequality, where there have never been these many far-right groups and this much, this much leaning towards violent extremism. Their point is that it's actually liberalism that needs to go through a major sort of deep dive and not a particular culture or community. Do you think that's one of the big lessons to draw for large nations such as ours that are pluralistic in nature but need to think harder about what that pluralism is really?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what you are saying is very interesting. In the fight against terrorism, the type of policies that you are going to implement depend on your understanding of where terrorism comes from. And there are a lot of debates on these topics, and even scholars and academics do not agree. So there are people who think that radicalization and terrorism comes from ideology and from theology, and that the current terrorism that we are witnesses comes from a radicalization of Islam itself, and therefore the answer must be found in a religious reform of Islam and the way Islamic scripture is interpreted. So that's one interpretation. But obviously, IDs alone do not kill people. You need people who believe sufficiently in those IDs to them. So you need to understand, why do those ideas resonate with people at a certain moment in time? And this is where the explanation in terms of ideology is not sufficient to understand what is happening today. There is another scholar in France named Olivier Roy, who has said that terrorism does not result from the radicalization of Islam, but rather from the Islamization of radicalism. So with this idea that we have in Europe, European societies have produced, youth that are, socioeconomically vulnerable, that do not find jobs, that are in a situation of despair, and that are ready to use violence to express their despair and their anger. And Islam is not the reason for their radicalization, but it is only the theological justification for it, but it's not the actual cause, and the cause has to be found in socioeconomic inequality and the production and of despair in our societies today. And then there's a third interpretation that says that we also have to look at foreign policy and military interventions of Western countries abroad, with this idea that violence leads to violence, and when you wage war abroad, it has consequences at home. And therefore, if you want to fight terrorism, the answer is not in fighting more wars abroad, but rather trying to reflect on the content and the meaning of your foreign policy. So there is a number of things, ideology, socioeconomic conditions, and foreign policies. And I think we need to have a very holistic approach, including all those things, if we want to really successfully target the issue of terrorism. And the problem is that most governments today have only focused on the issue of ideology and psychology. So trying to find, individuals who are psychologically fragile or that subscribe to extremist understanding of Islam and focus only on them. But in doing so, these counter-radicalization policies completely ignore the socioeconomic dimension, but also the political dimension in terms of foreign policy and the military interventions abroad.
What is your own sense, Professor? I know it's difficult to crystal ball gaze, but what is your own sense of how things will end up with extremely stringent counter-radicalization measures? How do you think this will play out in the months and years to come?
Unfortunately, this counter-radicalization policies have not really proved efficient because, as I said, there is a problem of focus of these policies. A lot of these policies try to identify radicals beforehand, but the signals that they use are irrelevant because, as I said, they focus a lot on religion and theology, but a lot of the people who committed terrorist attacks in Europe were not people who are particularly religious, so you could not have spotted them before. These were individuals, involved in petty crime, that did not have formal religious training, that knew very little about religion. But the effect of these policies is that they target a specific population based on religion. An example of that was the New York Police Department surveillance program that was implemented in 2002 and that led to massive surveillance of any Muslim citizen that had, origins from specific countries. So most of the time, Middle Eastern countries, but also South Asian countries. So this led to a massive surveillance program with police informants in mosques, students being followed, conversations being listened to and recorded. This program lasted from 2002 to 2014 and did not lead to any actionable piece of intelligence to fight against terrorism. So it was a massive infringement on civil liberties, massive religious and racial profiling, massive discrimination against Muslim citizens that did not lead to anything in terms of fighting against terrorism, but that did lead to a complete disqualification and a feeling of exclusion from the Muslim population itself. And when you remove someone like this from the national body, that creates a lot of frustration and anger among the youth, and that also creates a dangerous situation. So I would say these policies have been counterproductive and they need to be reframed.
You mentioned foreign policy as well, Professor. While the US is not the leading light, it is certainly a large player in geopolitics, and there is a change of government there and perhaps a change of stance as well on two broad trends, which is migration and socioeconomic inequity. Are you expecting to see any major changes over the next couple of years, or do you think there will continue to be large pushback against migration? And there will continue to be this large chasm that that exists between different communities.
Yeah, well, if you are talking about the Trump presidency, I think Donald Trump did accelerate a number of trends in terms of surveilling Muslim population. He called for a Muslim registry. He did this executive order with the Muslim ban that banned citizens from a number of Muslim countries, plus North Korea and Venezuela, but mostly Muslim countries, from traveling to the United States. So Donald Trump did have an impact in terms of the visibility of American foreign policies towards Muslim countries, but I have to say that he also was part of the continuity of American policies that targeted Muslim people and Muslim citizens. His idea of having a Muslim registry was only a new iteration of what already existed. There were always Muslim registries, such as the National Entry Registration System, that already targeted Muslims from 24 countries. So with the obligation for young men from 24 countries, mostly Muslim countries, to register when they arrived on American soil. So this already existed before Trump, so he was not new in that sense. And although President-elect Joe Biden said that he would revoke the Muslim ban on day one when he becomes president, he is also part of a continuity of American policies. So I am not expecting much change there. I am expecting maybe a change in communication, but not so much in policies themselves, because again, Donald Trump was just continuing what the United States has been doing for quite some time now.
A final question to you, Professor. Sitting here in India, many well-regarded economists have made the point that hate and divisiveness do actually amount to economic loss and distress caused to a nation. Do you think the track that India is taking in terms of now bringing on policies and mixing religion with it will be further detrimental to a nation that does have a large segment that is struggling economically?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. Yes, when you put political pressure on populations and minorities that are already socio-economically deprived, it only increased the tensions, and tensions are not good for the economy. So I would really encourage caution. I know, elections are coming in France too. We have elections coming, and it's always good for votes to be strong on Islam and on the Muslim minority. So that I see that the political advantages that some politicians might retrieve from it, but the long-term effects in terms of the strength of the social fabric, citizenship, living together are just disastrous, and you can feel the tensions now, and you feel them in India as well. And this, I'm not an economist, but I would say this type of tensions are never good for the economy.
Absolutely. It's been such a pleasure speaking with you, Professor. Thank you so much for taking time out and talking to me. I know it's been a conversation we've been waiting to have for a long time. So thank you indeed for taking time out.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.